morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us in the world. I used to always just say good afternoon, and then I would mess up and say good morning. I'm saying both. That's what we're doing today. Welcome to Crazy Talk. If this is your first time watching live TV, talk about all sorts of things related to mental health. If this is not your first time watching Crazy Talk, welcome. So if you are watching this video, give us some likes, give us some loves. We'd love to see those little bubbles pop up across the screen. So I am your host, Lee Thomas. I want to start off with a big shout out today. I want to give a shout out to George Street Middle School in Frederick, at George Street Middle School on Thursday, doing a presentation about, stigma, about anxiety, about social media and self-esteem. And the kids there were so smart. It was absolutely ridiculous. They asked brilliant questions, and it was just an incredible experience. So big shout out to George Street Middle School. I also want to do a new segment, or a relatively new segment to Crazy Talk, and it's called Crazy Good News. And so my crazy good news that I want to share with you folks today is an event happening at Grimross Brewery, again in Fredericton, New Brunswick. It's happening tonight at 8 o'clock, and it's a fundraiser for the Canadian Mental Health Association. So if you are in Fredericton, you should definitely check that out. So I've talked for long enough. I just want to now a wonderful guest, Sarah Schuster. So Sarah Schuster is the mental health editor at The Mighty. She currently lives in Los Angeles, but graduated with a journalism degree from Syracuse, New York. Writing is her one true love, but she fell in love with editing after working with the amazing contributors from the Mighty community. So Sarah, I'm so glad to have you.
I'm so happy to be here.
Oh, well, we're so glad that you could join us. I know you're joining us from LA, and it's super, super early in LA. And we've already got our first comment from Rudy. So Rudy says, hello from Los Angeles. Rudy, we both absolutely adore you. So thank you so much for tuning in. So Sarah, you are the mental health editor for The Mighty. I don't want to make assumptions, but I feel like that's probably the sort of job that you get into because you are passionate about that kind of work. So I guess my question is why? Like why writing, why editing, why mental health?
Yeah, it's not random. that's for sure. So I mean, wow, why writing? I've always loved writing, and actually mental health and writing is very connected to me before I even realized that it was. When I was first starting to feel a lot of anxiety or going through like first bouts of depression, I would just journal about it. And that was like my way of getting it out. And I didn't really realize that was like what I was doing. But like, if I look back at like my 8th grade or 9th grade journals, it's like full of stuff. I'm like, oh my God, like that's what I experience now when I'm anxious. And at the time I just thought I was just like whatever, like getting all this stuff out in my journal. But the real reason I actually started being interested in mental health was actually through my brother. It wasn't until, I want to say like my junior year of college that I started kind of looking at myself and being like, oh, like mental health affects you too. But my brother, when I was a senior in high school, he was hospitalized out of the blue for a suicide attempt. And that was like pretty significant only because I had never really knew anybody who did that. I didn't really know that he was struggling, and we were actually pretty close. So that was really hard, knowing that he had actually been struggling and I like didn't see it because I was so preoccupied with like my life in high school. So when I entered journalism school, my family was going through a lot with my brother, figuring out, he got diagnosed with OCD. He was in treatment for an eating disorder. Like they were going through this whole journey. And I was kind of at school, kind of being more of an observer. And I would like call home and I'd get the latest update, but it wasn't something that I talked about with any of my friends at school because the first time, and it sounds like a classic story, but the first time I told somebody like, oh, my brother has OCD, it was like one of those like classic responses like, oh, like like I get OCD in my shoes. Like it actually happened. I was like, oh my God, I can like looking back, I'm like, this actually happens to people where people say things like that. And I remember being like, no, like they don't understand the weight of what like OCD means to my family. And so I didn't talk about it with anyone. Fast forward, I'll keep this shorter. I ended up my junior year is when I started first having kind of like really passive suicidal thoughts. I would literally have the words "I want to kill myself" stuck in my head while I was walking to class, or I would have like self-harm urges, and that was like very new for me and very scary. I was always somebody who just like kept myself busy, kept myself busy, kept myself busy. I'm very good at compartmentalizing, right? So like stuff's happening at home, but I have this whole other life at school. Like they don't need to be touching each other. That's too messy. But a friend actually ended up pushing me to see a counselor. And how I started with the Mighty was that I actually published a blog in college that was like a coming out piece about going to the counselors at our college. Because at the time when I was going to the counselors, again, I was putting on gym clothes and telling my roommates I was going to the gym and I was going to counseling because I was like, there's something wrong with me that I'm having these like bad thoughts. And when I finally got connected, actually, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Active Minds, but I got connected with Active Minds at Syracuse University. I'm like, oh my God, like there are people who talk about mental health. Like what? And so like I told them my brother had OCD and they were like, oh, OCD. Like they knew what it was. And it was such a great experience. When I got involved there, that's when I wrote this blog, and the Mighty ended up republishing it. And I became a writer for them. And I wrote a few more things. And it just so happened that I was graduating like a year later looking for a job, and I kept in touch with them. And that's how I transitioned on the teams. That's a very long answer to your question, but it's hard for me to answer that question without like telling the whole story, because my job with the Mighty is so connected to like my own personal experience with anxiety, depression, and OCD, and also my family's experience. Obviously, I didn't like start working at the Mighty and things were like, oh, now I'm like fine. Like I've done a lot of work since then, but that's how initially how my passion started. Like I really identified as like a sibling of someone struggling, and then I figured out like it's okay to embrace my own mental health struggles. And like working at the Mighty and being exposed to different groups talking about mental health, like really, really helped me do that. I'm gonna stop talking. That was so long.
No. I loved it. I loved it. Please, like, don't feel bad about it. Okay. I think that role of sharing your story and owning your story and really, you know, but really, you know, taking that writing and that editing role of your own story into your own hands, I think is so important. Something that I thought was really interesting, and you talked about kind of, you know, the Mighty being a place for you to kind of explore your own mental health and that sort of thing. But through being an editor, I know that you read a lot of stories of people who've gone through really, really difficult things. So how do you, I guess, maintain your own mental health through that when you're kind of constantly consuming the stories who are struggling?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Because I think that for a while, again, like queen of compartmentalizing things, what I'll basically say when people ask me that is that I've really learned to put on like an editor hat. And when I'm editing Mighty stories, obviously they're very touching, but there is like this sense that you have to be like a little removed, because if I kind of got emotionally, I don't even want to say invested, because I am invested. But there is a sense of space that I've almost learned to put as a survival, because it is true. Like I'll joke to people that like, yeah, like I read about suicide all day, just like all day. I read about self-harm. I read about people in their lowest moments. I also read a lot of stories of hope. So it all definitely balances out. And we have this joke at the Mighty where like all of us have cried at the office at some point. All of us. Nobody has not had to leave the room, because I think, again, we're all there. We're all editing the stories. And I actually remember like exactly which stories kind of got me, where I wasn't able to keep my editor hat on, and it hit me really personally. And I go for a walk, and I, take a break. And I think that being able to both have like a little professional distance when I'm editing stories and really seeing them as stories that I want to make sure that they're told well. And I'm looking obviously for like spelling mistakes and doing all that stuff, but then also acknowledging when like, okay, this feels really heavy. I need to go for a walk, or maybe I should like take 15, like we have like stretch breaks. Like maybe I need to go, maybe today I need to get like lunch with a coworker. I think both those things are how I survived. Because I think if I was all emotionally invested all the time, that would be really tough. But also if I was all removed all the time, that would also be a weird position. Like I don't want to become desensitized to the stuff. I don't want to read a story about someone's, husband taking their life and just be like, okay, like another day at the office. Like I still want to feel those things. So you have to balance it. But yeah, I mean, I guess just like taking breaks. And also, we try to spread out the content too. So I have associate editor, Juliet, who is really interested in childhood trauma, because that is like aligned with her experience. And there's days in a row where she'll edit like 5 trauma stories in a row. And I'll kind of check in with her like, hey, Juliet, like, want to do like an anxiety listicle now? Like not to diminish like the stuff we do about anxiety, but almost like making sure the content is varied enough can also help too. So there are most things, but I guess just keeping it balanced, not becoming completely robotic, but also like learning to kind of like put up like a little safety net around yourself, because at the end of the day, you got to go home. And I go home and I watch like junk TV. Like it's actually hard for me. So if I go home and if there's one point me and my boyfriend watching like an intense show, and he's cut me off from shows before, because sometimes I go home and I'm so emotionally raw that like if anything dramatic happens, I'm in tears. So that's stuff too, like making sure I'm going home. And my boyfriend actually is in mental health and we live together. So sometimes we'll go home and we'll catch ourselves talking about mental health again. And sometimes I have to be like, I love you. I want to hear about your day. Like, I want to hear your day. You work at a treatment center. I want to hear about your day. But like, can we talk about this over the weekend? Like, I can't right now. So setting those boundaries too, being like, okay, like mental health is important. I read about it and wrote about it all day. Now I just want to like watch The Office and like eat dinner and be silly and not have it be like my entire day. I think a lot of mental health advocates, need to have that balance. It's a heavy space. People need to be taking care of themselves when they're doing this kind of work. I mean, Lee, I could ask you the same thing, right? Like when you're so, not to flip it on you, but when you're so involved telling your story and doing speeches and like, it's your job, right? Like you're like, a lot of your like livelihood depends on being in the space. Like, do you ever have a hard time with that?
I mean, well, look at you flipping the questions on me.
You see that's how the J school flip.
I think it is something that I used to struggle with a lot more than I probably do now. And I also create that kind of emotional space. It's one of those things where I still, and I've learned as I've, done more and more speaking engagements and that sort of thing, I'm better able to recognize when I'm feeling really drained or really vulnerable or kind of any of those things. And like, even now, like I've been working as a public speaker for 3 years, maybe.
Wow.
And like my speaking engagement at George Street Middle School on Thursday, and then the rest of the day, like I had meetings and stuff, and by 6 p.m. I was like, it is time for bed, because like it's exhausting and it's draining to be that raw. But I think it's important, kind of like you said, there's a balance to be had there, because you want that rawness, but you also can't be so raw that it's painful and then you fall into it, right? Like you want to be like, this is authentic and it's real and this happened. But that hope piece for me is where that shift happens, is that, you can go through a really rough time and come out the other side of it. And I always leave my presentations on like a note of hope, because for me, it's very important that we don't big, cavernous void of, wow, there's a lot of horrible stuff out there.
That's good for people. It's like, it's a takeaway. It's like a takeaway. They need to leave with something.
Yeah.
They can't just be, things are bad.
Things are bad. Sorry, goodbye.
Like, mic drop. That's it.
Which I guess is kind of a question that I have about some of like the work with the Mighty as well, and like, I mean, the work that you must do in terms of editing and curating, because for me, my line is that is true, but is not helpful for me to tie into my presentations. Right. Like, it's something that is still too raw or too painful for me or whatever. And for me, am I telling this because they need to hear it, or am I telling it because I need to say it? And if I'm telling it because I need to say it, then I don't say it. But if I'm telling it because they need to hear it, then I think it's important to tell that. So do you ever have situations with the Mighty where you're like, wow, is true, but it's so triggering or so whatever that it might not be helpful for people? Or is that not a distinction that like comes up much? Or I guess, how do you handle that?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. There is a distinction. And I guess like the easy answer is that some of it is actually like in our editorial guidelines. So as I've been like editing all these stories, we've kind of developed guidelines to help, newer editors about what, and I think you said it well, like what's kind of like raw information that can help people and what's just raw information that honestly, like maybe is better kept in a journal. And they're just different kinds of information. So a really good example, and a very clear-cut example, is that we, especially recently, our trauma section has been growing. So we're actually starting, I don't know when, but we're starting, even just based on the submissions that we're getting, to start this trauma section that maybe isn't like, it's almost like a sister of the mental illness section, but you don't have to like be diagnosed or like say you have a mental illness to talk about trauma, right? So we're really just talking about the mental health effects of trauma. And we've had to learn in editing those stories what details to keep and which to not. And there are a lot of stories I can't accept because it's someone, again, and I hope it was therapeutic for them, detailing exactly what happened to them. And then the story ends. And I look at this and I'm like, I understand why you wrote it. Again, I hope it felt good for you to write that. But it doesn't have that takeaway. It doesn't have that nugget where if we publish this and package it and post it on Facebook, that's again, like obviously, like when you share something so raw and so personal, there's always a chance that someone's going to say like, I relate to that, or that happened to me, and that's helpful. But there are ways to tell those stories that, again, like leave you feeling at the end that not only that you're relatable, but also it doesn't even need to be hope, but there's like some like larger point. So for example, when people talk about maybe being in a situation where they were sexually assaulted, there might be some elements of that story that are helpful, right? So for example, if you were sexually assaulted by a friend, that's different than being sexually assaulted by a stranger. If like you, didn't say no, so now you feel guilty about it, that's different than, if someone who fought, like they're just different experiences. And so I'll keep in details like that because I think it's important for people to be able to relate to those specific instances. But anything beyond that, like we probably have to cut because it's not, again, it's like the difference between what you post online and kind of what like you should get out other ways, like what you should be talking about in therapy. Like I think we're in this really weird space where everyone's being more open online, and it's so amazing. And I even think for your own personal boundaries, it's really good to know, like, okay, like again, like what should I say in therapy? What should I write in my journal? What should I post online? And I feel like I don't even know if that answered your question. I kind of got lost in that like trauma anecdote. But the answer is it's tricky, and that I end up, and I don't want to censor people. But I also need to acknowledge that, okay, like, maybe we don't need this 4-paragraph long descriptive part in your essay when you detail how you tried to kill yourself. Like, like maybe the point of your piece is strong without that. And some people might disagree with me, but that's just kind of the way we've learned to edit pieces. We're being very sensitive to my reactions. If I read a piece and I'm like, this part, not that it didn't make me feel good, but also made me feel good, and that was it, then maybe it's actually strong without it. So I don't know. It's tricky. It's really complicated. And I'm sure you were saying you go through the same thing, where that's actually from an editor's standpoint. I feel like personally too, there is something to be said for processing your own, can I swear? Processing your own stuff before putting it out there. I think it's a personal choice for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And like you mentioned, like it is such a complicated question and a complicated topic. And it'd be so easy if it was like, this is the answer to that, right? But it's no, there's no clear-cut answers for it. It's kind of a learning on a case basis. Yeah.
I've learned so much.
Oh, sorry, you go.
I was gonna say really quickly, like we have these editorial guidelines, but they're only guidelines, and I've learned a lot from experience and from how people react to pieces. So actually a lot of my editorial guidelines are based on me literally, like when I was first starting out, I would literally edit a self-harm piece and email someone who I know has a history of self-harm, who's like in like a place of recovery, and be like, hey, does this piece rub you the wrong way? Like, what do you think about this? And actually getting feedback from real people. That's a really good way to gauge it too, to actually talk to the people who will be affected and be like, obviously trigger warning, like make sure you're in a good space when you read this. But I love your feedback, because like I don't have all the experiences, so I can't make the right call all the time.
Yeah, totally. And so I just want to point out, so we got some comments from Brianna Chang, who is just an amazing, amazing human being. And also apparently a contributor to The Mighty, which is fantastic. So Brianna, we're so glad that you're tuning in. Brianna also asked a question on my Facebook earlier, so I figured this is a great time for me to ask you, which is about kind of around reducing stigma in the workplace, and how can we do that? Because, mental health as your job. And so how does, the stigma in the workplace piece, I guess, work both in your workplaces and other workplaces you've seen?
Yeah, it's so funny because the Mighty's workplace is definitely very unique. Pretty much all of us working there are battling some kind of health thing. So it's like very common for people to be out at doctor's appointment or needing to take half the day because they have a migraine. Like it's a kind of a joke that we're all kind of like not falling apart, but like everyone's going through their stuff because they're connected to the Mighty, because probably of a health condition. So it's almost like this ironic part of, you're working for this community, you're also part of the community, you're going to have to take some days off for your health. And I remember when I moved to LA 3 years ago, and I wasn't in therapy because I was in a new city. And it got to the point where I was like, okay, I got to start like practicing what I preach and like find a therapist. And the only woman who could see me, I would have to leave work early. And I remember being like, oh my God, like, I don't want to leave work early. Like, how can I tell them? And my boyfriend being like, you're the mental health editor. If you need to leave early for therapy, you should be able to leave early for therapy. So I emailed my boss being like, I have a therapy appointment, Thursdays at 5, so I have to leave early. And he was like, okay. And it's because it's so ingrained in the work that we're doing, it has been easier for me to be like, gotta pop to the psychiatrist this afternoon, or I've actually, it's so funny, I've actually taken like one true mental health day, but I did take a mental health day where I was like, I'm so anxious that I like can't think. And I literally emailed my boss being like, I can't come into work today. And I figured my stuff out in a day. So I think the Mighty, it's like hard for me to speak to other work environments. But something that I have found, even within the Mighty, and I don't know about other companies, but because we're still technically like a startup, we have this like startup culture where like everyone works a lot and we're all in the office all day. And I think that the best way to kind of address mental health in the workplace is like starting with your coworkers. And so this is like a quick little example. So when I first started, you would get submissions via email. And if I got like 10 emails a day, I was like pumped. I was like, people want to share their stories. Like, this is amazing. And then 10 emails a day turned to like 20 emails. Then it was 50 emails. And soon the inbox was so full that I wasn't getting back to people on time. And so I have a really hard time being like, this is too much for me. So I didn't say anything. I just like, it was like my secret of just like, oh, the inbox is like, I have 1,000 emails, like, da, da, da. It was something that I really kept inside me. And I have another coworker who's not with the Mighty anymore, because she's having a baby, which is amazing. But she ran our community email, which is the more general email. And I remember the two of us were at work, like we were the only ones left at the office. And I just said to her, like, Vicky, are you overwhelmed by emails? And she goes, yes. And we had this moment where we're like, okay, like I can talk about this, like, like it doesn't have to be something that I hold secret. So I think finding little moments like that with coworkers where you have a friend at work being like, hey, like it takes being vulnerable, but being like, hey, like that meeting, I was so anxious during that meeting, and kind of like seeing how they react. Or like if someone asks like how your weekend was, being a little honest and being like, honestly, like I cried for 2 days in a row. I think starting that culture is a more practical way of doing it than going up to your boss and being like, mental health, or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, and I don't know, people have a different relationship with their bosses, but I really think it starts with the culture. It starts with like starting little communities almost like in your office and finding safe people you could talk to, because, it's so funny, like we know this, but it's still so hard to do. If you go up to someone and you say like, hey, like that was really stressful, or hey, like, man, I feel like work has been hard for me because I've been struggling with depression. Not that everyone will react well, because we know that some people don't understand, but I feel like people, it gives them an opportunity to open up about what they're going through. So a lot of times making those connections with your coworkers can again like create this culture. And then hopefully when, God forbid, you do need to take some time off for your mental health, or you do have to do something that's kind of more has to go through some like work system, maybe it'll be a little more okay. And that's like my loose advice. Just like I've learned it with my coworkers that, so I manage a team of like 3 people, and like there are days when they ask me how I am, and I'm like, not that great. Like I'm actually struggling today. And we have like this really good thing where, and sometimes I don't want to say it's too much. It's also where their job is so unique, but like I know how, like I usually know like, okay, this person's struggling with depression today. This person's feeling anxious. Like I usually have a gauge on how everyone's doing, both because of just like the type of work we're doing, but also because I try to be open about my own mental health. And I think that helps. So like, yeah, like, be like a little leader in your work. Just like see what happens if you just put it out there. Um, I obviously not every company culture will be welcoming of that, and that's too bad. But it's like, got to start somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are almost out of time, but there's one more question that Rudy asked, and so we wanna leave with a challenging question.
I'll keep it quick.
So Rudy said, "How does the Mighty deal with accusations of clickbait?"
Oh my God, I know what he's referring to. That's so funny. So I'll keep this really, really quick. Basically, this is something I've learned. When you title things for social media, it's different than titling things for a magazine. So I think one thing people don't really perhaps understand about web publishing is that when you like buy a magazine, you bought it. It's in your hands. And so if a title of a piece is called The Sunset, you might read it anyway because like you bought it, it's in your hands. If you're scrolling on Facebook and you see a title called The Sunset, you're probably not going to look at it. And so in order to get people into our stories, we've developed this very much like internet way of framing things. And that usually means teasing something. It usually means giving people an incentive to click. And I think that I'm definitely someone who used to be like, I'm never gonna like write a listicle online. Like I'm never going to be that person who's like 10 things you need to know about this. Like that's like lowbrow content. But at the end of the day, if you're writing stories you want people to read, you have to title them in a way that's going to get people to read them. And the reality of publishing, not to get too much into the publishing stuff, is that people aren't going online, and maybe they are, I shouldn't, most people aren't going online based on like the data of our traffic and typing like themighty.com, like what's on the Mighty today. They're on Twitter and they're on Facebook. And if we feel like we're doing something good, and if we feel like we want people to read, we want people to read the stories that, first of all, our amazing contributors spent the time to write, and also that we, edited and gave some love. You have to sometimes do internet titles that maybe do seem a little clickbaity, but the definition of clickbait that we use is that when you click in, you feel tricked. So if we called something like 4 things you didn't know about depression, and as someone who experiences depression, I like read it and I'm like, I feel like everyone knows about this, I wouldn't title it that. We do try to make sure it's a genuine title. So people click in, they're not like disappointed. They feel like they got what they came in for, and that's important to us. So thanks, Rudy, for putting me on the spot about clickbait. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah. No, and that I think was a beautiful question. So I can't believe that we're out of time. This has been such a blast talking with you. So if someone's watching this, oh my goodness, Sarah is incredible. Sarah is amazing. I need to get in touch with her. I need to learn more about what she's up to. What's the best way for people to do that?
Yeah, the best way is on Twitter. I'm at Sarah Eliz Tweets. So it's Sarah with an HELIZ tweets. And actually my email's in my bio. I'm not like the best at responding to direct messages, but I try. So if you want to hit me up on there, give it a shot. And yeah, I love touching people on Twitter. That's definitely the best way to get in touch with me.
Okay, fabulous. And I'll also put a link to that down in the comments in a couple of minutes once we log off. So thank you so much for being on the show, Sarah. It was an absolute pleasure having you on here. It was a very like insightful and like opening conversation for me. So I'm going to be like percolating over the next week. So thank you so much for joining us. And for our viewers, thank you all for joining us. If you liked this episode of Crazy Talk and you're like, wow, I would love to get episodes of Crazy Talk directly to my inbox, then you can sign up for my mailing list. I'll put a link to that in the comments below. Thank you all so much for joining us, and be sure to tune in next week at 12:30 Atlantic again, and I'll be interviewing Kelly Bowes about eating disorders. So really excited. Thank you all so much, and have a great afternoon or rest of your morning, depending on where you're joining us from. Have a good one.
AKA me.